Hello again. This segment we want to talk about general biblical approaches to hermeneutics, that is Bible interpretation, and specifically hermeneutics in the early church period. We count it no gentleness or fair dealing in a man of power to require strict and punctual obedience, and yet give out his commands ambiguously. We should think he had a plot upon us. Certainly such commands were not commands, but snares. The very essence of truth is plainness and brightness. The darkness and ignorance are our own. So wrote John Milton. You might remember who John Milton is, the author of Paradise Lost, and at least 100 years ago was regarded as one of the 4 or 5 greatest writers of all time. Well, he was a Christian. And Paradise Lost is a masterpiece not only of thought but of poetry. But Milton was writing in an era when prophetic speculation was rife, and he's reacting to the fact that, of course, speculation depends upon the imagination of men oftentimes and makes us dependent upon our own imagination or that of others. And he was saying that in the political arena of his own day, it was not advantageous for any ruler who wanted to be obeyed to be obscure in what he said and what he commanded. So Milton's responding to the political tensions and atmosphere of the Puritan era when it seemed like civilization itself was at stake. Well, he's of course comparing the political situation of his day with the reality that the Bible itself should demand interpreters. No one can doubt that certain aspects of the Bible demand interpretation. Certain dark sayings of the Word. We remember that Peter himself said in 2 Peter that there were certain things in the Apostle Paul's writings that were difficult to understand and were twisted. Well, that's true of the Bible as a whole, but Milton's point can't be gainsaid that what advantage is there to God in making most of his demands and commands obscure? So, building on that point, in the volcanic era in which John Milton lived, when both church and world were examining afresh the nature of authority. Authority was the issue in the Reformation and Puritan periods, both in the political sphere and in the sphere of interpretation. In the 17th century, who had ultimate power on earth? Has God given divine right to kings? That was in the air at the time. Or should monarchs be accountable to a duly constituted parliament? The birth of the British Parliament was in Milton's own time. In Milton's day, a king, Charles I, lost his head over this issue of authority. In the church, for a century already before Milton, war had raged over another authority issue. What should have ultimate authority among Christians? Church or Scripture? And if Scripture, as Protestants voted in theory, how was Scripture to be rightly interpreted? The Roman Church insisted that the ordinary Christian had not the skills to rightly divide the Word, that the Bible was dangerous in the hands of the common man. The Protestant sentiment generally, however, was in favor of dissemination of the Bible to peasant as well as prelate. Suddenly, after the Reformation, there was an urgency to make the Word accessible to the common man in his own languages. The faith of Milton, that God would not speak in dark sentences if he wished to be obeyed, was about to be carried through in practice. But why had it taken 1600 years? For the first generations of Christians, it was sufficient that Christ and the apostles had laid down orally sufficient truth for faith and conduct. That deposit was faithfully transmitted for about 100 years. That is, until the apostles and those who heard them had died off. In this circumstance, heresy could make limited inroads. However, in the 2nd century, controversy over church authority would make both the canon of Scripture and its right interpretation issues of practical urgency. Christ himself, to be sure, had run into a seemingly immovable object on this issue. That object was the inert mass of Jewish tradition accumulated upon the Old Testament revelation, and in fact burying the Old Testament revelation. The ultimate comment on the wrongness of that approach is that those very Jews who idolized Scripture failed to recognize the one whom Scripture testified. You might remember the text on that in John 5, verses 38 to 47. But how can we approach the Word if Israel failed? We have even more than sin and tradition to overcome. We have an immense linguistic and cultural gap as well. That is 5,000 miles and 2,000 years or more. This realization brought to birth the science of hermeneutics. Now, Berkhoff defines hermeneutics as the science that teaches us the principles, laws, and methods of interpretation. He goes on to set this science's task as the removing of the distance between an author and its readers. Bernard Ramm likens hermeneutics to a rule book and exegesis to the game. Without the rule book, Bible interpretation would resemble a dialogue with Lewis Carroll's Humpty Dumpty, who set as his rule, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Hermeneutics in the early church. It was, ironically, a non-apostolic church that gave us the first system of Scripture interpretation. Clement of Alexandria and his disciple Origen, under the influence of rabbinic method and Alexandrian philosopher Philo, Judaeus, refined an hermeneutical system that would prevail for over 1,000 years. Origen's method assumed 3 levels of meaning in the biblical text, corresponding to the body, soul, and spirit analysis of human personality. In this system, the spiritual meaning of a given passage was usually the allegorical understanding, particularly where the Old Testament seemed to picture God in a less than flattering light. The Alexandrians, like the translators of the Septuagint 300 years before them, were prone to explain away the literal sense. Milton Terry explains, quote, many of the theophanies and anthropomorphisms of the Old Testament were repugnant to the philosophic mind. The biblical narratives were often treated like the Greek myths and explained as either a historical or an enigmatical embodiment of moral and religious lessons, unquote. The famous historian Adolf Harnack called Origen's allegorical system biblical alchemy. Not all of the fathers, though, gave in to the Gnosticizing, Platonizing tide, accommodating Scripture to Greek thought. Julius Africanus, for instance, showed a healthy respect for the literal meaning of the Bible text. So did Lucian, who founded what has come to be known as the Antioch school of interpretation. This tradition was best exemplified by Theodore of Mopsuestia and John Chrysostom. Both of those fathers existed, by the way, in Throve in the 5th century or a little earlier at the end of the 4th century. Though the former was more exacting as an exegete, that is Theodore, he came to doubt the canonicity of portions of both testaments. Chrysostom was to have more influence. Indeed, he's been called the greatest commentator of the ancient church. The Church Catholic, unfortunately, continued to be dominated by the Alexandrian school. Augustine, for instance, though undoubtedly the greatest theologian and thinker among the fathers, was severely hampered by his poor knowledge of Greek and his ignorance of Hebrew. As exegete or interpreter, he was inferior to his contemporary Jerome, who was not as hamstrung by allegorization as Augustine was. Ambrose and other fathers of that era, that applies to them as well. Jerome, of course, had a knowledge of Greek as well as Hebrew, which gave him a great advantage. In the next segment, we'll talk about interpretation in the Middle Ages and the Reformation.